Here we are start to discuss barriers to communication. So we have already discussed that communication is the art of transmitting knowledge, ideas, information, and thoughts from from one person to another. The transfer should be such that the receiver understand the meaning and the intent of the message and give proper feedback to the sender. Barriers. There are three levels at which communication takes place. One, noticing is done with the senses and is at the physical level. Second, understanding is at the level of intelligence. Third is acceptance is at the emotional level. So, if these physical, intelligence, and emotional level uh, did not receive the things accurately or as it is as sent by the sender, then it will become a barrier to communication. Anything that hinders the process of communication at any of these levels is a barrier to communication. Barriers to communication can be defined as the aspects or conditions that interfere with effective exchange of ideas or thoughts. Okay, so here are the classification of barriers. First is physical barriers, second is semantic and language barriers, third is socio-physiological, psychological barriers, organizational barriers, cross-cultural barriers. So we'll start with first physical barriers. So physical barrier is the environmental and natural condition that act as a barrier in communication in sending message from sender to receiver. In organizational environment or in interior workplace design problems, technological problems and noise are the part of physical barrier. For example, doors, walls, distance, etc. If we are talking to someone on phone and we are in the traffic, then the noise barrier will happen. Sender could not communicate to the receiver what he want to communicate. And if the music is loud, we could not communicate what we want to communicate, and we could not receive what receiver is interpreting or give a feedback. Okay, then it is become a physical barrier. Now it is semantic and language barrier. If we are talking about the semantic barrier, these are refers to the misunderstanding between the sender and receiver arising in semantic barrier due to the different meaning of words and other symbols used in the communication. As we know, there are words which are similar in pronunciation but different in meaning. If sender chosen a word which is different and receiver received the same in different perspective, then the communication, the message, what he want, the context, all things changed. This is semantic barrier. The semantic barriers usually arise when the information is not in the simple language and contains those words or symbols that have multiple meanings. Okay, if we want to communicate something in a form which should be understood only by receiver, it may be a secret communication. If in certain missions in army they use a code language that should be understood only by the receiver, at that time semantic barrier arose. Following are the main language barriers: word with different meanings, faulty translations, unclarified assumptions, denotions and connotations, technical jargons, bad expression. Okay. Now, socio-psychological barrier. The psychological or emotional barriers refers to the psychological state, that is opinion, Sender's opinion is different and receiver's opinion is different. Sender's attitude is different, receiver's attitude is different. State of consciousness of sender receiver is different. Their emotions are different, etc. Of a person that deeply affects the ability of communication. Second, the communication largely depends on the mental condition of the person. If the person is not mentally or emotionally sound, then he cannot communicate effectively, either as a sender or a receiver, because both required a psychological or emotional thing to communicate. Emotional they include their psychology into the message. What sender want to communicate, exactly the message received by a receiver, it is very important. They have to match the psychology. Their psychology should be the same at the same time at the same message. Otherwise, communication would not have happened and it becomes a barrier to the communication. The main kinds of psychological or emotional barriers are lack of attention. If sender is sending something, receiver is not paying attention, then message could not be understood by the receiver. Premature evaluation, before receiving or having more information about a particular thing, receiver misinterpret or evaluate an incomplete message. Poor retention, loss by transmission, distrust on the sender or receiver. If they are not trusting each other, then it become a barrier. Their emotions, if they are not matching their emotional things, then it will become a barrier. Organizational barrier now. The organizational barriers refer to the hindrances in the flow of information among the employees that might result in a commercial failure of an organization. If we are working in an organization, there are certain barriers which come across, like rules and policies. Management communicate differently and the workers received the same in different manner. Hierarchic positions, organizational facilities, complex organizational structure, etc. Cross-cultural barriers. Cross-cultural communication defined language and cultural misinterpretations. It is based on knowledge of many factors, such as the other cultural values, perceptions, manners, social structure, and decision-making practices, and an understanding of how members of the group communicate verbally, non-verbally in various social contexts. Cross-cultural barriers means if someone is from Maharashtra and someone is from UP, so they have to understand their culture. They do not have any right to misinterpret any culture or the perception, the values of their culture. Okay, then if they do not understand the same, then it will become obstacle, a barrier to the communication.